going to kick us off, and people can keep joining as we're starting off here. But welcome, everybody. My name is Maddie Kempner, and I'm the Policy Director at NOFA Vermont. I'm just here to facilitate the workshop this evening, which is part of a week-long series of events that we're hosting right now in honor of Agricultural Literacy Week, and a little bit more about Ag Lit Week as we shorten it at NOFA. It is a week-long virtual celebration to inform, educate, and create community around the topic of resiliency in all of its forms. Each night this week from Monday through Thursday, we're featuring a webinar bringing together the voices of our community, including Farm Worker Rights Group Migrant Justice, who's here with us tonight, Missisquoi Abenaki chef Jesse Lawyer, students of gender studies and agriculture at Bennington College, and organic farmers building soil health and feeding their communities. If you are interested in more information about the other events that are happening as part of Ag Literacy Week, I'm putting a link to that page on our website in the chat. And I'm going to start us off with a little bit of an intro video that will share more about what Agriculture Literacy Week is all about. And hopefully I can do this successfully. Also, I will let you all know that this webinar is being recorded and will be circulated to everyone who registered later on.
My name is Jason Broughton. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Libraries and your State Librarian. I'd like to welcome you to Agricultural Literacy Week. In understanding Agricultural Literacy Week, it's important to understand why agricultural literacy is important to everyone, particularly from a library perspective. We're all about learning and literacy, and understanding how food is grown helps everyone understand the importance of where food comes from, how we consume it, how we dispose of it, and how it nourishes us. So it also helps farmers, those in agriculture, and all persons who want to make a life in growing food. In understanding that food helps communities in a variety of ways. One is resilience. To have a resilient community, one must have systems in place that can weather adversity. Food is one of those systems that we must understand. So I want to thank you for participating in this year's Agricultural Literacy Week, and I look forward to you joining our events. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Grace Odell, and I'm the Executive Director of NOFA Vermont. We're so glad that you're joining us for Agricultural Literacy Week. Ag literacy is critical to our work at NOFA in building a just, verdant, and ecologically thriving food system. Everyone needs to understand how food is grown, how it gets from the field onto your plate, all the people along the way who support that process. Understanding the how of how our food system works is so critical to transforming the food system we have to the food system we need. A community that's truly resilient is a community that's in right relationship with its place and its land, with the people who make up that community, and with its values. These offerings we're excited to share with you as part of this Agricultural Literacy Week are a small way of helping share some of our values with you and inviting you to join us. Thank you so much for joining. We hope you enjoy.
All right, thanks everybody. So with that, I will just share before we get into the main section of our workshop. I'll share a little bit more about NOFA Vermont quickly. We are a statewide organization that works for an ecologically resilient, economically viable and socially just Vermont food system that benefits all living things. We do a lot of work in the food system across many different areas, from farmer services to organic certification, to food access, to farm to institution and farm to school. And we're excited to have you join us. And I'll also just say everyone is nailing it on the Zoom protocol so far, but just please remember to keep yourselves muted if you're not speaking. And we will encourage everybody to put any questions that come up as we're going through the workshop in the chat, and we will leave some time at the end for Q&A and discussion. So feel free to put your questions or things you'd like to discuss later on in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. And I am very excited to turn it over to our presenters at Migrant Justice, Madeline and Will. Thank you so much for being here.
Yay, thanks very much, Maddie. Appreciate the introduction, and good evening, everybody. We're very pleased to be here with you. So I think we're gonna be sharing our screen, and Matt, are you enabled to do that? All right, so as we get that started up, my name is Will Lambeck. I'm a staff member at the organization Migrant Justice, Justicia Migrante. I'll let my colleague introduce herself.
My name is Madeline, also part of the Migrant Justice team, and my job is to work with allies at the organization.
And we may be joined at some point tonight by a farm worker and member of Migrant Justice's Farm Worker Coordinating Committee, Uriel. It just will depend on his schedule if he's able to join us in time. But so if so, then we'll be doing a part of this bilingually. He'll be speaking in Spanish and Madeline will be interpreting for him. Or if he's not able to join us, then it'll just be Madeline and I in English. Everybody can see the shared screen, and as we go through, feel free to be putting questions into the chat box, or if you miss something, or we go too fast, or there's something confusing, we'll be looking at that as we go along. So feel free to interact that way. And if for some reason we aren't seeing what's in the chat, feel free to take yourself off mute and jump in. So we really want to thank NOFA Vermont for having us as part of this series, and I think it's really cool to have Migrant Justice as a labor organization, a farm worker organization, to be part of this series on sustainability, because when we think about sustainability in food systems and the agricultural world, we think about the human side of that as well, and that we're creating food systems that aren't extracting unsustainably from the land, but that also aren't extracting unsustainably from human beings as labor, and that people's jobs and lives are respected and treated with dignity. And so that's why we're here tonight to talk about a program called Milk with Dignity. So I know it can be hard on Zoom to have it super participatory, but if folks feel like, if you've had any background with Migrant Justice, if you've ever participated in a Migrant Justice event before, or have heard about us or signed a petition at some point, feel free to put that in the chat. We'd love just to start seeing what your background is with the organization. Or if this is the first time that you've ever heard about Migrant Justice, put that in the chat as well. We'd love to hear that, and we hope at least there's going to be a couple folks tonight where this is your introduction to the organization. So next slide, please. All right. So Migrant Justice, for those of you who don't know, is an organization that's founded and led by immigrant farm workers in the state of Vermont. It's a grassroots organization that's committed to building the voice, capacity, and power of the immigrant farm worker community, and engaging allies outside that community to advance human rights and economic justice. Next slide. Migrant Justice has been around for the last 10 years or so. We were founded in 2009. And Migrant Justice's story actually begins with a tragedy. A young dairy worker named Jose Obet, a 19-year-old from Chiapas, died in a preventable workplace accident. He was working on a dairy farm in Vermont, and he was killed by the farm equipment. If he had received proper training and if he had proper protective equipment, he'd be alive and with us today. But his unnecessary and terrible death served as a spark for the community to begin to organize and say, hey, we've had enough. We aren't going to keep living like this, and to start to come out of the shadows and build a community together. People started coming together in assemblies, meetings together, which continue to this day. They're the building block of the organization. And that's where folks come together, share food, build community, and start talking together about, hey, what are our common problems? what's happening on my farm, what's happening on your farm, what's happening in our community, and through popular education and analysis, start to develop collective solutions to those common problems. And out of that process of community assemblies, Migrant Justice formed a human rights roadmap that guides our work to this day. And so the campaigns that we organize, or the collective action that we take, is based on that human rights roadmap. So very briefly, just some of the achievements that's happened over the past 10 years, changing state law to win access to driver's licenses, regardless of immigration status, organizing to stop deportations of members in the community who have been targeted by ICE, including through a very high profile settlement in a federal lawsuit that we had against ICE that was settled 2 weeks ago. Some of you may have heard about that. We've passed policies around the state to prohibit racial profiling and the collaboration between police and deportation agents. But throughout that, as we've done a lot on the sort of policy and immigrant rights side, we've always maintained a focus on the right to fair work and dignified housing. Next slide. So backing up a bit and looking at the dairy industry itself, the dairy industry in Vermont, as well as around the country, has become an industry, as with many economic sectors in the country, that's sustained by immigrant workers. We estimate that as much as 80% of non-family employees on dairy farms around the state are immigrants. And as many of you know, this isn't seasonal work. This is year-round, 365 days a year. And so sometimes people get tripped up by the idea of migrant workers and think that it's a seasonal or transitory thing. But when we're talking about the labor force that powers our dairy industry, we're talking about folks who are here for years or decades at a time, who are setting down roots and raising families, who are part of this community. Over the years, we've done a number of surveys with hundreds of workers in the state to elucidate what some of the conditions are and get a better understanding and real data for what are the issues facing workers in the dairy industry. And so from that, we've seen that there are astronomically high rates of accident and injuries, whether it's with chemicals, heavy machinery, animals, and that's coupled with a lack of access to healthcare and a lack of training and protection. There's also a general lack of labor protections. As many of you will know, again, agricultural workers are exempt from many of the nation's and the state's labor protections. And so that means that workers are exposed to unjust firings, gender discrimination, sexual harassment, human trafficking, sub-minimum wage, working 60 to 80 hours a week without overtime pay, and that where rights do exist, there's a real lack of enforcement. And that particularly applies to on-farm housing. Almost all immigrant dairy workers in the state are living in employer-provided housing, but oftentimes that housing is not code compliant because there's no enforcement. So folks are living in old housing, sometimes sharing 2 to 3 people in a room or sleeping in common spaces. Workers generally frequently report that the water will go out or the heating will go out, appliances break, and that's a very consistent and salient aspect of people's experiences. But as much as we highlight what some of the systemic labor violations and systemic human rights violations are in the industry, we also always say that there's a range, and there are farms that are providing decent wages and good conditions and dignified housing. And so we know that while these problems are systemic to the industry, they aren't on every farm, and the conditions don't necessarily need to be this way. There are other options out there. Next slide. So when we look at these systemic problems, we have to ask ourselves, why are conditions like this? What are the factors that lead to people living and working in these conditions? And what we've seen is that even when a farm employer is trying to do right by their workers, they're trying to pay them a good wage, they're trying to give reasonable breaks, and provide quality housing, there are economic challenges to improving conditions, and those challenges are structural to the industry. So we talk about the industry structure as being an industry dominated by corporate supply chains. And this isn't something that's unique to dairy, but we're seen in many economic sectors, right? But this pyramid shows the corporate power that controls the dairy industry. And you can see that with workers at the bottom, and then the employer to the cooperative, and then the cooperative to the corporation. That's the flow of the milk, and is also the flow of power and control. And the industry over the past several decades has become increasingly characterized by few buyers at the top who hold a lot of power. And that means that they're able to lower the price of milk. And when the price of milk is lowered, that creates a downward pressure on wages and labor conditions. And so what we see from that is that the price of milk today is, what that means is that the price of milk today is about on par with where it was in the 1970s. And that is due to the increasingly monopolized, or the increasingly consolidated nature of the dairy industry. And so with that analysis, what Migrant Justice has seen is that workers and employers, or farm workers and farmers, actually share many of the same interests in transforming this industry, that they have more that brings them together than that keeps them apart. And it's the companies at the top of those supply chains that are responsible for the problems in the industry. And so it's those same companies who should be held responsible for becoming part of the solution. Next slide. And so what is that solution? We've created a program called Milk with Dignity. And Milk with Dignity is bringing a new day for human rights in the dairy industry. So Milk with Dignity was created to address the root causes of those problems, because it's not something that works just between employer and employee. It's a program that exists throughout an entire corporate supply chain. The way it works is that a dairy buyer or a company will commit to buy from farms that are enrolled in the Milk with Dignity program, and to pay those farms a premium. And then the farms in that company's supply chain, they receive the premium and they commit to using it to come into compliance, or to improve wages and conditions, to comply with a code of conduct. And that code of conduct has been written by the workers themselves. And it creates standards for things like wages, hours and rest, housing, health and safety protections, and creates protections as well against harassment, discrimination, and retaliation. And so in sum, we say that this code of conduct represents farm workers' definition of what dignified work and housing looks like on their farms. So farms commit to complying with this code of conduct, but for those standards to be meaningful, workers need to be educated on what their rights are in the Milk with Dignity program. So the farm also commits to allowing Migrant Justice, the worker organization, to come onto the farm to educate workers about their rights in the program. And through that means workers are empowered to become the frontline defenders of their human rights, because they know what the standards should be on the farm, and they're the ones best positioned to know when the farm is not meeting those standards. And then to ensure that farms are complying with those rights, and to give workers recourse when they see something that's not being upheld, we have created an independent third-party monitor, a third-party organization to monitor conditions, to respond to workers' complaints, and to regularly audit all farms in the program. And that monitor is called the Milk with Dignity Standards Council, or the MDSC. So if a farm doesn't comply with the code, the MDSC has the power to suspend that farm from the program. And suspending a farm means that they lose their premium, and they also lose their ability to sell to companies that have signed Milk with Dignity agreements. And so that creates market consequences to ensure that farms are going to be enforcing this worker-authored code of conduct. And that structure, the elements of legally binding agreements with companies, farm worker authored code of conduct, worker to worker education, a premium paid by the company, and then real monitoring with monitoring of those standards with enforcement backed up by market consequences. Those are the elements that make Milk with Dignity work. Next slide, please. So those elements that we laid out are part of a larger social change model called worker-driven social responsibility. And My Good Justice is one of the workers' organizations at the forefront of this new trend. So in many countries and sectors, economic sectors, workers are learning the same lessons that dairy workers in Vermont have learned about how to advance rights within an industry that is dominated by corporate supply chains. And My Good Justice learned from an organization called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a group of tomato pickers in southern Florida. And the CIW has created a program called the Fair Food Program, which governs tomatoes and now other vegetables and produce as well. And the Fair Food Program, they have really pioneered this model and have signed now 14 agreements. If we go back one slide, 14 agreements with some of the largest corporations in the world that they'll only be sourcing these products from farms enrolled in the Fair Food Program. And so years ago, dairy workers from Vermont went down to Florida and began to learn about how is it that they've really transformed this industry through worker-driven social responsibility. They came back to Vermont, adapted those principles to the dairy industry, and that's how Milk with Dignity was born. And with the CIW and others, we formed a network to support worker exchanges and foster learning between other organizations. And so now this network includes from tomato pickers in Florida to garment workers in Bangladesh, who are targeting global fashion brands with the Bangladesh Fire Safety Accords, to construction workers in Minnesota who are targeting real estate developers with a program called Building Dignity and Respect, and many, many more. And all these groups are united by this same model of organizing within supply chains to win contracts with corporations and implement programs designed by workers themselves. So we had created the program, and now we had to put it in practice. We had to go out and sign an agreement so that the program could start to work. And we decided that the first invitation would go to the company Ben & Jerry's. Next slide. And before we talk about the Ben & Jerry's campaign, just a question from Jeanette in the chat. Yeah, the premium is paid to the farmers, to the participating farm in the company's supply chain. It's a premium price for their product. Thank you. So getting into the Ben & Jerry's campaign, we approached Ben & Jerry's several years ago. We invited them to join the program. At first, they were not receptive. And so it took about 3 years of public campaigning and negotiation, which included protests in front of their stores, street theater, pickets, marches, a speaking tour, to build enough pressure until, as you see in this photo, in October of 2017, we signed the first Milk with Dignity agreement. And this was a really historic moment because for the first time in history, a corporation had sat across the table from dairy workers in its supply chain and signed an agreement treating each other as business partners, recognizing that relationship and the company's responsibility to workers in their supply chain. And since the agreement was signed in 2017, the program has been implemented in 100% of the company's Northeast supply chain. And so it's currently covering over 250 workers on farms totaling about 20% of Vermont's entire dairy industry, as well as farms in New York State, where Ben & Jerry's also sources. So that means on those farms, My Good Justice is going to give annual education sessions. The Milk with Dignity Standards Council is monitoring those farms to ensure compliance, and that millions of dollars are flowing from Ben & Jerry's directly to workers' pockets in the forms of raises, bonuses, paid vacations, and more. And that, sorry, let me back up a bit. So, and this goes to Jeanette's question. So Ben & Jerry's is paying the premium, it's going to farms, and then farms are investing that in raises, bonuses, paid vacation, improvements to housing, in order to come into compliance with the code of conduct. And then anything that the farm doesn't use to achieve compliance is retained by the employer as economic relief, understanding that they're also getting hit by the low prices of milk. And so with all those changes, we can truly say that the new day has come to the dairy industry. Next slide. And to hear a little bit about what that impact has been on workers themselves, we're going to play a video now, which is a 6-minute video hearing from workers about how the Milk with Dignity program is affecting them. Go ahead, Nan.
Okay, let us know in the chat if you can't hear the audio.
And we should say that the first couple seconds don't have audio, so give it a sec to start out.
Mi trabajo empezando pues nos levantamos en la mañana, llegamos, prendemos las máquinas, arreglamos todo, sacamos las vacas del corral, las metemos para ordeñar. O sea, es todo lo que se hace en un día normal, pero que hay ranchos que trabajan de 12 horas corridas, le dan media hora de comida de las 12 horas, eso está más pesado.
¿Por qué es necesario? Porque es importante para nosotros como trabajadores que salimos de nuestra casa para mejorar nuestras vidas, no para estar viviendo como te dijera, en condiciones que meramente ya no son humanas.
Pero sin el programa nosotros pues no nos aumentaban el sueldo y pues del día de descanso ni se hablara. No sabíamos qué derechos o qué podemos exigir nosotros como trabajadores.
Pues antes aquí no nos tomaban en cuenta como cuando nos enfermábamos. Ni nos llevaban al doctor y pues ese día lo teníamos que trabajar. Y si no lo trabajábamos, pues ese día pues era descontado prácticamente. Y pues ahora bajo el programa de Leche con Dignidad, no lo trabajamos y pues aparte no nos pagan, y pues ya los patrones nos llevan al doctor. Y pues eso es muy importante para mí, para nosotros.
Bueno, se siente uno más protegido, porque ya sabe uno puede, o sea, ellos te orientan a lo que puede pasar, a lo que tus derechos que tú tienes como trabajador, el derecho que tienes, el respeto tanto de tu patrón, se siente uno más feliz, más protegido.
Si un día yo, por ejemplo, cuando voy a tirar cal en los grupos o hacer el agua de las patas, no tengo las mascarillas, los guantes, todo lo que necesito para que no me dañe mi salud, entonces ya el patrón tiene que acceder a comprar las cosas.
Ahora ya tenemos un día completo, que antes no se tenía. Bueno, ahora que tengo mi bebé, pues ya pasamos más tiempo con ella. Ya tenemos por lo menos un día para estar con ella todo el día. Se siente uno más seguro por todos los beneficios, pues, y saber todos nuestros derechos.
Mediante el programa se ha hecho posible tener una casa nueva, porque antes estábamos en una traila que estábamos más amontonados, 2 personas en un cuarto, poco espacio. Entonces aquí la nueva vivienda pues ha cambiado demasiado porque todo es nuevo.
Hay algunas personas que le dan miedo para hablar con los dueños o exigirle algo que ocupan o cualquier cosa, ya sea porque pues tienen miedo porque los corran o algo así, los despidan del trabajo. Con el programa nos hace trabajar mejor, más a gusto, más en confianza con los dueños, sabiendo cuáles son nuestros derechos, o sea, de no ser humillado o decir o que te digan cosas que te ofendan. O sea, hay muchos ranchos que pasa eso y por el programa ya no puede pasar eso. Como los del rancheros también se benefician mucho por el programa. Así, yo creo que ambos tienen un gran beneficio, como nosotros, un gran beneficio entre ambos.
Y para mí es muy importante que expanda el programa porque por eso el patrón le apoyan a él, pero tampoco también como nosotros como trabajadores tenemos esa voz de ya decir, sabes, quiero un día de descanso, quiero que hagas esto, y eso es algo necesario para cada trabajador, para que nosotros nos sintamos seguros en decir algo, no nos sintamos con miedo, sintamos la seguridad de decirle al patrón, sabes qué, quiero esto, y ya no tengamos tanto miedo a ellos.
So if folks feel so inclined, feel free to pop something into the chat about just your reactions to seeing that video and any thoughts that are generated for you. And with that, I will turn it over to Madeline, who's going to take us through the second half of this presentation.
So as you can see in the video, the impact of the Milk with Dignity program has been incredibly powerful in Ben & Jerry's supply chain. However, there continue to be farms which remain outside of the program, and those farms lack the protections for farm workers. And this is a photo from actually from earlier this year in the winter, where a farm worker who's pictured in front with the green sweatshirt, Jose Ramos, had his wages stolen at a farm where he was working in Madison County, and actually faced violence when he tried to speak up about the situation to his employer. So Jose decided to organize, to stand up for himself, and he called on his community and allies to come together and protest the situation with him. So this is a photo from that day. It was an extremely powerful protest, but this situation really shows the difference between farms that are covered by the Milk with Dignity program and farms that continue to be outside of the program. Because in a situation like this with Jose, this is something that Will mentioned the Milk with Dignity Standards Council and their job to enforce the code of conduct and farm worker rights on farms within the program. And so having wages withheld or facing violence is something that never would have happened on a Milk with Dignity farm. And actually things like wage theft and violence fall under what are called the zero tolerance policies of Milk with Dignity that have very serious consequences. So this situation really shows the need to expand the Milk with Dignity program. And so after lots of analysis and study and strategy, the Farm Worker Coordinating Committee of Migrant Justice, which leads the organization, decided that the next company to approach and invite to join Milk with Dignity would be Hannaford. And I imagine that many of you are familiar with Hannaford, maybe even shop there. That I often shop at Hannaford. It's a supermarket chain across the Northeast with almost 200 stores. So that makes Hannaford a very significant buyer of dairy throughout the region, and an important seller of local milk under the Hannaford store brand. Hannaford Supermarket is owned by a multinational corporation called Ahold Delhaize. And Ahold Delhaize has an annual global sale of $74 billion. And so one of the reasons why Hannaford made sense as the next company to approach with Milk with Dignity is because they can afford this program. Another reason why Hannaford makes sense is that Ahold, this parent company, already has a supply chain program called their responsible retailing program. And so they've committed to sourcing practices that respect human rights. And so what we're saying is Hannaford, if these are values that you already stand for, then why not take action and take a step to support what you're saying you stand for and join Milk with Dignity. Many supermarkets that Ahold actually owns several other supermarkets, and many of them are already part of, Will was mentioning the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the CIW, based in Florida in the tomato industry, and their Fair Food program. So many of the supermarkets that Ahold Delhaize owns are already already have agreements, Fair Food program agreements with Ahold. And so this is a model that they're familiar with. And we're just asking them to expand it to their dairy. And when Hannaford joins Milk with Dignity, it will have an enormous impact in expanding the Milk with Dignity program and bringing a new day to hundreds of workers, not just in Vermont, but across the New England region. So a little bit about where the campaign is at. Last summer, Migrant Justice reached out to Hannaford several times, actually, to invite them to sit down and talk about Milk with Dignity, and there wasn't any response. So on October 3rd of 2019, almost exactly a year ago, a little bit more, which was actually the second anniversary of the day, that historic day that we saw a picture of earlier when Ben and Jerry signed on to Milk with Dignity. That's when Farmworkers decided to publicly launch this campaign calling on Hannaford to join Milk with Dignity. Then a month later, in November, Migrant Justice coordinated an action at 22 different Hannaford stores across New England, where groups of allies got together in support of Milk with Dignity and delivered letters to their local store managers calling on the chain to join Milk with Dignity. In addition, several national organizations have endorsed the campaign and asked Hannaford to join the program. And we also sent almost 4,000 signatures from petition signatures from customers calling on Hannaford to join Milk with Dignity. And then this spring, we began to escalate the campaign because we were still not getting any response from Hannaford. So in March, Farmworkers went on the road in a regional speaking tour to help spread the word about Milk with Dignity and build support for the campaign. And this was all in preparation for a mobilization that we were planning, this big march that was going to be at the Hannaford headquarters, which was supposed to be in April, but that's when COVID hit. And so we know that the pandemic has had huge impacts on food systems as a whole. Grocery workers have been very rightly celebrated as the, whoops, I forgot to change the slide. Grocery workers have been very rightly celebrated as they put themselves at risk to keep the food shelves stocked in our stores. And food chain workers throughout the supply chain, which include dairy farm workers, have also been deemed essential workers, and so have continued to work throughout the pandemic. And while farm workers who are covered by the Milk with Dignity program have really benefited during this time from the program's protections, stuff like paid sick days, having access to personal protective equipment, the ability to speak up without fear of retaliation, farm workers who are outside of the Milk with Dignity program have been made even more vulnerable than ever during this time. On the flip side, Hannaford has seen a huge spike in profits. The Hannaford sales have grown by 34%. Stock prices have risen by 25%. And while Hannaford is really benefiting from the pandemic, they're not doing anything to protect the health and safety of farm workers who are behind their store brand dairy products. And so, despite the pandemic really altering our plans, we had to come back and figure out what we were going to do differently with the pandemic. But we've continued to put pressure on the company. And so on May 1st, here in Burlington, there was a car rally, which ended at one of the local Hannaford stores. In June, we coordinated a mass call day of action where hundreds of phone calls were made to fill up the CEO of Hannaford's voicemail. And now we've been working on this series of virtual presentations to help spread the word about Milk with Dignity and the Hannaford campaign. On October 3rd of this year, which brings us then to the third year of the anniversary when Ben & Jerry's joined the Milk with Dignity program, and also marked one full year of campaigning, calling on Hannaford to join the program. On this day, Migrant Justice publicly released the first biennial Milk with Dignity report at a press conference in St. Albans. And this report documents the successes and incredible impact of the Milk with Dignity program over its first 2 years. On that same day, we also coordinated a National Day of Action where delegations in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Maine, and New York, 25 different delegations in these 5 different states, which are all of the states actually where Hannaford have their stores, made a trip to their local Hannaford to deliver a copy in person of this newly printed Milk with Dignity report, and call on the store managers to pass it up to their management and urge the CEO and the Hannaford chain to join Milk with Dignity. This is a slide that just shows a little snippet from the full report, but really encourage all of you to take a look at the whole report. You can find it on the Migrant Justice website. But this gives you a window into some of the successes which were documented in the report. And so you can see here how the premium, which Will was talking about, the premium, which in this case Ben & Jerry's pays to participating farms, has already had a huge impact on improving farm worker rights through things like wage increases, worker housing, paid vacation, sick time, personal protective equipment, and overall working conditions, like you heard about in the video. And so we're already seeing these actions over the last year and a little bit starting to have an effect. We're seeing that the pressure is working. Earlier this year, Migrant Justice participated in an annual shareholder meeting of the Ahold Delhaize Hannaford's parent company. And the president of Ahold's board of directors was forced to address the Milk with Dignity campaign publicly and in front of all of the company's shareholders. Soon after that, they released a report making bold claims about the company's commitments to human rights. And they even mentioned supply chains in that report. And that commitment made its way all the way down to Hannaford. The day after receiving hundreds of calls demanding Milk with Dignity, the Hannaford company spokesperson said, this is a quote from her, "We expect all our suppliers to follow the law and treat workers fairly. We require our suppliers to comply with standards of engagement similar to a code of conduct, including provisions for how they treat and compensate workers, maximum allowable working hours and days, premium pay for overtime, and workplace health and safety." So these are really strong words, and Hannaford would not have made this commitment if it were not for this Milk with Dignity campaign that's putting pressure on them. So it's clear that they're feeling that pressure, and they're trying to find ways to make the Hannaford brand look good. But words and empty promises will not really address the systemic human rights violations on farms within the Hannaford supply chain. Only joining Milk with Dignity will do that. And so a relatively small group of farm workers in Vermont and this mega corporation, Ahold Delhaize, that brings in $75 billion every year. How are we going to win? How are we going to win this campaign? We know that every company's Achilles heel or their weak spot is their brand image. And actually, something that Mike Vail, Bale's the CEO of Hannaford, has said, and this is his quote, "The biggest responsibility I feel like I have is to protect the brand. Our brand is everything. Our Hannaford cornucopia, what it stands for, is critically important. That keeps me up at night." And so that's how we're going to win, is by making Hannaford realize that the cost in the image of their brand, the cost of not signing on to Milk with Dignity is actually higher than the cost of joining the program. And we know it's possible because we did it with Ben and Jerry's. And as Will was talking about the campaign, it wasn't easy. It took 3 years, but we won. And we know that we can win with Hannaford too, and we're gonna need your support. I'm gonna leave it on this slide to highlight the social media handles here in the Migrant Justice website. The last one is the migrantjustice.net/get-involved is a really important one for signing up to get tuned into the Allied network that Migrant Justice coordinates, so that as we continue to build pressure and momentum in the Hannaford campaign, we're looking at future days, phone call actions, there'll be social media opportunities to support, and one day we'll be able to continue the plans with the speaking tour and the rally. But getting connected and getting tuned in now is critical, so that you're able to stay up to date and you know what's happening and when it's happening, and how to support. So with that, I think I'm gonna take us off share screen so that we can see each other's faces and open it up for questions.
And actually, we're fortunate to have Uriel joining us. Hola, Uriel. So before we open up for Q&A, why don't we turn it over to Uriel to give some more context for what we've been talking about. ¿Cómo estás, Uriel?
Bien, bien, Will.
Entonces, sí, acabamos de terminar las diapositivas acerca de la campaña y el programa. Y sí, no sé si te gustaría agregar un poco más de cualquier cosa que quieras de las condiciones en la industria, del impacto del programa o de la campaña actual con Hannaford, como quieras.
Ok.
Will,
you want to go for it, man?
Dale.
¿Listo?
Sí, dale.
¿Qué tal? Mi nombre es Uriel, soy parte del Comité de Coordinación de Justicia Migrante y también soy un trabajador lechero acá en Vermont. Pues sí, estamos trabajando de la mano con los compañeros de la organización y he visitado algunos ranchos y he visto las necesidades que hay en muchos ranchos. Hace 3 años, como vieron, Ben y Jerry firmó el contrato de leche con dignidad y ahorita queremos que Hannaford haga lo mismo.
¿Está bien si traduzco? So Uriel says, hi, my name is Uriel. I'm part of the coordinating committee of migrant justice. And I'm a farm worker here in Vermont in the dairy industry. And so I'm working with others and have visited many farms in the area. And I've really seen the need in many of these farms. 3 years ago, Ben and Jerry's signed on to the Milk of Dignity program. And right now we're campaigning so that Hannaford will do the same.
Y como les comentaba que en muchos ranchos hay necesidades de las viviendas, pues creo que si Hannaford firma el contrato, pues muchos ranchos serían beneficiados.
As I was saying, I've seen in many farms the need for improvements in housing. If Hannaford signs on to Milk with Dignity, many farm workers will benefit.
Hay ranchos donde hay trabajadores que duermen 5 o 6 en el mismo cuarto, o sea que la vivienda no está bien para ellos.
I've seen farms where farm workers are sleeping 5 or 6 people in the same room, where housing really isn't okay for the people there.
Así también hemos platicado con alguno de ellos y nos comentan que el sueldo es bajo y no tienen días de descanso, no tienen vacaciones y creo que si se unen los patrones se unen a Leche con Dignidad, creo que eso va a cambiar.
Also, I've heard from many who have really low salaries, who don't have any days off, don't have vacation time. But joining Milk with Dignity would improve things.
Lo que estamos buscando como organización es de que haya un cambio y queremos mejorar a todos los ranchos. Y ahorita del 100%, ahorita nada más hemos avanzado un 10%. O sea, creo que tenemos un camino largo por recorrer y no nos queremos quedar ahí, sino seguir avanzando.
And so what we're looking for as an organization is change. We want to make conditions better on farms. We want to get 100. We want to get there 100%. And right now we're only at about 10%. We have a long way to go, and we don't want it to. We don't want to stay here. We want to keep going forward.
Yo creo que hay muchas necesidades y creo que eso nos hace a que sigamos luchando para que todos tengamos un cambio, tengamos una vivienda digna, tengamos sueldo justo y tengamos vacaciones, y sería excelente tener también médicos disponibles para nosotros.
I think that there's a lot of need, and this motivates us to continue struggling until all of us have just work and dignified housing, have good salaries, vacation time. It would also be great if we had access to healthcare.
Gracias.
Thank you. Gracias, Uriah.
Sí.
Thank you both so much. Are we ready to open it up for questions? It looks like we have one in the chat from Jeanette.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody. And just to recognize what folks wrote at the beginning, it's really awesome to see a mix of, so Jonathan, your first presentation, first event. We have other folks who have been following the news but haven't met us before, like Kevin. And then Hannah, who's actually been participating in the campaign and has made calls to Hannaford, which is really awesome to see. And hopefully this presentation for you has given some more context and helped you understand the importance of having taken that important action. And we want more folks to be following Hannah's lead and finding opportunities to take action and supporting the campaign. So yeah, let's start with Jeanette's question. So aside from supporting the action, what can we do as consumers? Should we consider changing our buying habits with regard to Hannaford? Madeline, you want to take that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, strategy for the campaign is a huge, it's continuing to develop, and there's a lot of different things in the toolbox, like you heard about, the call day of action, regional days of action, social media actions. I think one of the last things would be calling for something like that. That's not somewhere where we're at right now, and those strategic decisions actually get made by the coordinating committee, which Uriah is here representing tonight. Yeah, I think plugging in, as I said, to like the Ally Network by signing up on the Migrant Justice website is like step one. If you're already there, that's awesome. Support Migrant Justice online on social media. And then there'll be lots of things coming up where I think we're looking at a call day of action in the winter, or in the new year. There'll be some exciting announcements coming out around the holiday next week that we'll be asking people to like amplify and share. Yeah, so I think really getting plugged in so that you're ready to act when there's calls to action. I don't know, Will, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, so to reiterate, at this point, there's not any sort of boycott call. We aren't asking people to not shop at Hannaford, but actually quite the opposite, that if you do shop at Hannaford's, if you're a customer and buy your groceries there, next time you're there, just take 2 minutes to, when you're in the checkout line, ask if the manager can come over and just say, hey, as a customer, as somebody who buys my groceries here, it's really important for me that I know my products are being made without human rights violations, where workers aren't being abused and exploited. And I really think the company should sign on to Milk with Dignity. That store manager isn't going to have the power. They aren't the decision-making authority. But when they're hearing that consistently from customers, that pressure flows up. So we really do encourage folks to do that. And then more formally, we also have like flyers that people can hand over to the manager if that's useful. But it could just be as simple as asking to speak with them, and it takes an extra 2 minutes in your shop. And we encourage folks to do that. We have a question from Kevin about is migrant justice working with seasonal migrant workers or guest workers as well as Milk with Dignity? I can take that. So yeah, Migrant Justice, as you heard, it's an organization that was founded and led by dairy workers, and that continues to be the primary membership of the organization. So that's been the membership and the focus of the work. A lot of the things that Migrant Justice has fought for and won have affected people far beyond the community of the organization itself. So driver's licenses, for example, that benefits anybody who doesn't have a social security number, not just farm workers or not just dairy workers, but the organization itself is composed primarily of dairy workers, not seasonal workers.
Will, do you want to share about the relief fund at all too, just as another win that really is beyond the dairy community?
Yeah, definitely. Uriel, están preguntando acerca de la campaña del fondo de los 5 millones. Aunque no es el enfoque de la presentación, ¿te gustaría compartir un poquito de qué es ese fondo, cómo lo ganamos y qué significa?
Claro que sí. Sí, bueno, antes les comentaba que estamos luchando que Hannaford firme el contrato, pero después vino la pandemia. Como saben, vino la pandemia y creo que nos vimos con la necesidad de darle prioridad al apoyo de que se les dio a los que viven acá, pero nosotros como migrantes no nos dejaron fuera.
Definitely. And so before I was telling you about how we're working to get Hannaford to sign on to Milk with Dignity, but then the pandemic hit. And so at that point we needed to prioritize getting support for the community, because we were seeing people here in Vermont getting support, but the immigrant farm worker community was left out.
Las únicas palabras que utilizaron para nosotros fue que éramos esenciales, pero nada más nos daban ese nombre como trabajadores esenciales, pero para el apoyo nos excluyeron de ahí.
And so the words that they used for us were essential. They gave us this name that we were essential workers, but at the same time were excluding us from support.
Luego empezamos a luchar de que no era justo que nosotros como inmigrantes nos dejaran fuera. Creo que nosotros somos los que mantenemos a varias industrias y creo que a toda la gente le llevamos un vaso de leche a la mesa. Nosotros arriesgamos la vida trabajando todos los días sin importar pues si esté lloviendo, si haya frío, calor, nosotros estamos trabajando ahí.
So we started to get organized. We decided that it wasn't fair to leave immigrants out. While we were maintaining various industries, we're bringing the milk to the table, and we had to continue working. We had to continue risking our health and going out in the cold and the heat and whatever weather to continue working.
Empezamos a hacer entrevistas, empezamos a dar testimonios a senadores, a legisladores para que nuestra voz sea escuchada. Y como antes mencioné que le dimos prioridad a esto porque no era justo de que nos dejaran fuera.
And so we started doing interviews and giving testimony, talking to the legislators for our voice to be heard, because it wasn't fair that we should be left out.
Al paso del tiempo, el gobernador aceptó de dar 2 millones para los migrantes. Pero hablamos nuevamente que hay muchos migrantes y creo que todos debemos ser incluidos de ese apoyo. Y seguimos luchando, seguimos trabajando, y cuando recibimos la noticia es que el gobernador había autorizado los 5 millones para los migrantes.
So eventually the governor agreed to give $2 million towards an immigrant stimulus. But there are a lot of immigrants in Vermont, and we wanted everyone to be included. And so we continued working, we continued organizing until we heard that the governor had actually approved the $5 million to fund this immigrant stimulus.
Y es así como recibimos la noticia y estamos contentos de que dimos un paso muy bueno y de que creo que nuestros derechos están siendo escuchados y que ahora sí fuimos incluidos dentro del apoyo, y a todos los migrantes salieron beneficiados, como los que están aquí, como las familias que están en México.
And so we were really happy when we heard about this. We see it as a really good step that our rights are being heard, and that we've been included in the state's COVID support, and that this is something that all immigrants here are going to receive.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Any final questions? Or put them in the chat, or feel free just to take yourself off mute. Oh, great. Have there been repercussions for workers who are actively organizing? Uriel, la pregunta es si ha habido represalias cuando los compas se organizan, han habido consecuencias o repercusiones. ¿Puedes contestar, o Madeline o yo podemos?
No, hasta ahorita no.
Yeah, so Uriel says that he hasn't seen any on a sort of larger scale, in different ways. Yes, it's not a regular occurrence that, for example, workers haven't faced, workers don't get fired for participating in migrant justice events or going to marches. We haven't seen that type of retaliation, although sometimes things do get tense between workers and employers around their participation in migrant justice. We haven't seen retaliation like that. But we have seen workers get fired when they speak up for their rights, or when they ask for a raise, or bring things to the attention of employers that need to be changed. And that's why the protections against retaliation within the program are so important. And what you saw in the video is this real sea change, where workers are saying outside the program, if you want to speak up, you don't do it because you're worried that you're going to get run off the farm or worse. But within the program, we feel like the Milkwood Dignity has our back, and we can speak up without fear. And that has been a really significant change that we've seen in the program. And then another aspect of the work, and we're sort of perhaps going down a rabbit hole with this one, but one significant aspect of retaliation that we've seen hasn't been from employers, but from the federal government. And some of you on this call will be aware, if you follow migrant justice, that migrant justice leaders in the organization have suffered significant retaliation from ICE, who's targeted the organization and its membership for surveillance and detention and deportation. And dozens of migrant justice members over the years have been detained by ICE or Border Patrol, many of them because of their participation in the group. And so we, because of that, were forced to bring a lawsuit against the federal government. We sued ICE on First Amendment grounds, saying that they were violating people's right to freedom of speech by targeting them and detaining and deporting them for speaking up and for defending their rights. And just 3 weeks ago, we successfully settled that lawsuit, and ICE dropped the deportation charges against the migrant justice leaders who had sued them. And they also recognized that regardless of immigration status, all people in the US are protected by the First Amendment, and that ICE has instructed their agents to refrain from targeting people for exercising their First Amendment protected rights. So that's a real victory, not only because farm worker leaders in the state have won a reprieve from deportation and are able to continue to live and work and organize and continue fighting for Milkwood Dignity, but it's also a precedent that other communities around the country are benefiting from now.
Looks like Jeanette was wondering if you were working with the ACLU at all on that.
The ACLU of Vermont was part of our legal team that successfully prosecuted that lawsuit.
Well, I'm actually curious. I have a question. I'm curious if you have a sense, or if you know for sure, like how many of the dairy workers working on farms in Vermont are actively involved with migrant justice.
Yeah, we don't have a dues-paying membership in the way that a labor union would. So there's not a direct sort of membership figure. But there are about 250 workers in the state at any given time that are involved in the organization's activities, either by participating in farm worker assemblies, or we're regularly visiting them and they're participating in activities through farm visits, or we're working with them to organize on their farm about a certain situation. And so that's maybe around 20% of the larger community is actively involved at any given point.
And do you know the total of number of workers? I think maybe one of you mentioned a number earlier, but that would be brought into the Milkwood Dignity program if Hannaford were to sign on. I know you said it spans Vermont and New York. I just wonder how many workers would be covered by that.
We don't know exactly, because Hannaford's volume, like any company, that's proprietary information. They don't share that until we start sitting at the table and negotiating the agreement. But we imagine it would be hundreds of workers who would be brought into the program. Their supply chain is likely larger than Ben & Jerry's, which has 260 workers in it. And it would be multi-state. So they buy milk from all across New England and New York. So when they join, it will expand the program into new states as well.
Actually, I have one other question if nobody else has one. I really appreciate your question, Jeanette, about just how people can get involved and support the campaign. And I was going to ask kind of a similar question along the lines of like, you know, how much work Migrant Justice does to just, obviously, I think you are very effective at raising the just awareness about these abuses, human rights abuses, to the broader public. And I'm just curious, like, how central that messaging is to the campaign and just like bringing in people who may not be aware, because I feel like there is so much of an understanding in the general public and among consumers, I hate that word, but for this purpose, about, you know, some of the failings of like the industrial food system in other areas in terms of like environmental impact or, you know, even animal welfare. Like there are all these certifications and labels related to, you know, all these other issues in the food system. And I feel like human rights is actually something that goes under a lot of consumers' radar and isn't something that people are really thinking enough or aware enough about. And just would love to hear your thoughts on like, I don't know, ways to lift that up or how you try to reach people who might not otherwise be aware of these issues.
Yeah, I think when a former coordinating committee leader named Victor kind of like coined this phrase, the cows don't milk themselves. And that's become something that we've used in the NOFA-VT campaign to like bring people in and connect them with this concept. Yeah, I don't know, like how do we use messaging in the campaign?
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking about like how to get this message to people that may not already, partially how to get this message to people that may not already be following migrant justice. And I guess that's just like a part of the overall campaign strategy to just like use all the channels you have available. But it just strikes me that like this is not an issue that is necessarily as much on consumers' radar as other issues in the food system. And that is really problematic and unfortunate because these are like human beings' lives. Yeah, just.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we do is webinar presentations on Zoom. But yeah, right, like, you know, this sort of thing, and there are folks on here where this is their first exposure to migrant justice, which is wonderful.
Yeah,
I think we can sort of end the way we started, which is talking about the integrity of the human aspect in when we think about what sort of food systems we want to create, and when we think about what does sustainability mean to us in agriculture and in food systems. That has to be a holistic definition of sustainability that includes human beings as well. And so I think NOFA has been a really key organization in helping to expand that definition and getting folks who come into the food movement thinking about organics and local and helping to broaden that more to include food systems that are sustainable for human beings as well.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we're really trying to get better at messaging is just sort of, and Milk with Dignity is such an exciting example of this, that just the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, that like this program is a win-win-win for, you know, the workers, for the farmers, for Ben & Jerry's, and that when we are fighting for rights for everyone, that, you know, it's not just benefiting the workers who I think, you know, need these supports the most, but it was really lifting up our whole ag economy and making all of our farms and communities more resilient. And I think that's something as an organization that has historically worked a lot more with farm owners, that is really important for us to be messaging loud and clear, because yeah, we just need, we need to expand this. And Milk with Dignity also shows that it is the most effective when it comes from the workers themselves, like you guys talked about. So yeah, it was great to learn more about your work with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers too. Well, thank you guys so much. And if anybody doesn't have any closing questions, I don't know if Will or Madeline, if you want to say anything else to close us, but I really appreciate you guys being here and sharing more about the program with everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. And we look forward to seeing you all in person eventually, hopefully. And in the meantime, hope that you can participate in online and in things like Nicole Actions and like Will mentioned, chatting with the local manager of your Hannaford store.
And also a heads up that Migrant Justice will be participating, I believe, in a couple of events as part of our virtual winter conference happening in February. So be on the lookout for that. And we will share out the recording of this presentation with you all, hopefully within the week or so. And we will share the links also that, that Migrant Justice shared for ways that you can get more involved along with the recording. So look for that too. Thank you all so much for being here, and hope you have a great night.
Thank you. And I would just say as well, thank you to NOFA for inviting us in. And then in the campaign that Uriel talked about the COVID stimulus funds, NOFA is also a major partner in winning that campaign and in getting the state legislature and the governor to create that fund and authorize those $5 million. So big ups to NOFA for the fantastic solidarity and the longstanding partnership. And then I think, Nikki on the call, you said that you're with NOFA New Hampshire. We're going to be doing a panel presentation with you all tomorrow night. So perhaps we'll be seeing you then.
Yes,
Gracias, Uriel.
Thanks all. Have a great night, everybody.
Adiós. Buenas noches. Good night.